All right, so we are looking at the divided kingdom. What is the kingdom that divided? This is not an auspicious start to class. Israel, very good. Israel is the kingdom that divided. How does this division occur? What does it end up looking like? We divide from one into two, right? And what are our two? Northern kingdom, southern kingdom, also called Israel and Judah. What's going to make that even more confusing is that sometimes Judah is going to be called Israel, and so that's what makes it really confusing as you get into the minor prophets somewhat. Who is after whose reign does the kingdom divide? After the reign of Solomon, that's right. So how many kings did we have over the quote-unquote united kingdom? 3, and those were Saul, David, Solomon. Kingdom divides after Solomon. The northern kingdom, which is called Israel, has who as its king? Jeroboam. And the southern kingdom, known as Judah, has who as its first king? Rehoboam. Very well, okay. Which of these kingdoms is going to last the longest? As a nation, Judah, the southern kingdom is, that's right. Who eventually is going to overrun the southern kingdom? The Babylonians under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar, that's right. The northern kingdom only going to be in existence as a functional unit for about 150 years. And then they are carried off captive by whom? By the Assyrians. The capital of Assyria was Nineveh, very good. And who was going to overtake the Assyrians? Bonus points for this one. Babylonians first. You're right. You're getting ahead of me, Brother Evans, but you're right. Yes, the Assyrians are going to be overrun by the Babylonians, who will then overrun the southern kingdom, right? And then they themselves are overrun, Brother Evans mentioned, by the Medes and the Persians. All right, 2 Kings chapter 24. This is where we get to talk a little bit about Manasseh. This is where we left off last week. Second Kings chapter 24, beginning in verse 1. Segundo de Reyes capítulo 24, verso 1. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. And then he turned and rebelled against him. The Lord sent against him bands of Chaldeans, bands of Arameans, bands of Moabites, and bands of Ammonites. So he sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through his servants, the prophets. Surely at the command of the Lord it came upon Judah to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done. And also for the innocent blood which he had shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not forgive. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And then Jehoiakim sleeps with his fathers, and Jehoiakim comes to the throne. There are going to be 3 times that Nebuchadnezzar comes against Jerusalem to take it. The first is in 2 Kings 24 and verse 1. The second is later on in chapter 24. Verse 14. And the third is going to be chapter 25, and that's when the kingdom is going to be absolutely, or the temple rather, is going to be absolutely destroyed. And everyone except the poorest of the poor are going to be led away out of the nation and out of the city. In this first Babylonian captivity that we just read about, who is the notable figure that's going to be taken to Babylon? This is going to be Daniel. Right, Daniel. This is how Daniel gets from Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's court that we read about at the beginning of Daniel chapter 1. The second campaign that Nebuchadnezzar is going to wage against Judah is where we're going to have Ezekiel taken from the land and deported to a new place, and that will be the location from which he is writing much of his book. And then, of course, in chapter 25 is when the nation is finally going to fall. Now, the reason the nation falls is revealed in part in 2 Kings chapter 24 and verse 3. Why is the nation going to fall? Why is Judah going to fall? Okay, the sins of Manasseh. And so that leads us to a very logical question, which is, what are the sins of Manasseh? That's right. Go back to chapter 21, capítulo 21. 2 Kings chapter 21. Josh, who was the father of Manasseh? There's a specific reason I'm asking you, and you know this. Hezekiah, you got it. There you go. So we go from a king who definitely had some high points in his reign, had some low points as well. Somebody who knew God, and now we get Manasseh, his son, on the throne, and describe Manasseh's reign over Judah. Yeah, he did, that's what 2 Kings is going to say, right? He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, right? And it's going to be the sins during his reign that really set the framework for why Judah is going to be judged. Verse 2, verso 2, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. He rebuilt the high places which his father Hezekiah had destroyed. What are high places that he talks about here? These would have been places of idolatrous worship, right? So Hezekiah had torn these down only for Manasseh to come back and rebuild them. He erected altars for Baal and made an Asherah as Ahab, king of Israel, had done, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. Now, verse 4. Now, remember, a few weeks ago we talked about the temple. Remember that? And we sketched out a diagram of what the temple would have looked like. We saw the washing place, the place of sacrifice, the huge altar that would have been there. We looked at what the temple would have looked like on the inside. And what does Manasseh do in the house of the Lord in verse 4? He builds altars, and coming to verse 5, he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. So he takes the temple, which is dedicated to God, which was just this fantastic structure to see, and in this structure he sets up these idols and these altars to these false gods. And if that's not enough, verse 6, what does he do next? Yeah, we've got human sacrifice going on now in Judah. Verse 6, he made his son pass through the fire. And that's a reference to human sacrifice there. He practiced witchcraft and used divination and dealt with mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Then he set the carved image of Asherah that he had made in the house of which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever." About which house was that spoken? That's the temple. So not only do we have altars to false gods, now we've got what in here? Now we've got an idol. An idol to a false god, not being placed by a foreign power to desecrate the temple, but being placed within the temple by the one who is ostensibly the leader of the nation. How do you get to that point? How do you get to a point where 15 years earlier, Hezekiah is beseeching God for more years to his life, and God is going to, well, that wasn't exactly 15 years before, but you go from a king who knew God and had some degree of respect towards God by the things that he does, to now a son who doesn't seem, at this point, to have even the slightest care about serving God. How do you get there? Go ahead, John.
And you might even back up and wonder how Solomon got to his point.
Sure.
Because the Bible says that God had appeared directly to Solomon twice.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like Solomon could ignore the fact that God existed.
Right.
God had appeared to him twice.
Right.
And he ends up doing horrible things. And then you have these other kings, and usually it's a little bit at a time, and by listening to the wrong people, and by compromising the truth. A little bit at a time, listening to the wrong people, compromising the truth, and doing what's popular.
Okay. Very good. Mike, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, I agree with John. That's how the term, you try to be politically correct and not mention a lot.
Okay.
So you accuse whoever just to
We're just going to appease and so that we don't have to have any sort of confrontation? Okay. Lala.
Tyler, the Israelites always wanted to be just like the other nations.
Going back to 1 Samuel.
King like the other nations. Give us an army. Give us chariots like the other nations. And boy, did they ever sure get it.
They become just like all the other nations here. That's what Manasseh's taken to heart, absolutely. Laura. Could have. Very well could have. Hezekiah's life is going to be extended. Now, look at chapter 21 and verse 1. Here's an interesting fact. Oh, Josh, yes, sir, sorry.
No, yeah, I think that's where you're going. Hezekiah ended up not being, he did some good things, but
Yeah.
he built himself up, or what's the expression?
Pulled himself up by his bootstraps? No.
I mean, God condemned him.
Oh, yes.
And that's the reason he showed.
Yeah, what he's going to show in his house and all that, yes. Chapter 21 and verse 1. Tell me something about Manasseh. Who said it? Mitch, anything significant jump out to you about that? He's not the youngest. Uh-huh. Travis, talk to us about him. Sure. Anyone, he's a teenager? Okay. Yes, my question is not specific enough here. Anyone here like math? Are you willing to admit it in front of other people? If you like math and you've done a little bit of math, what does chapter 21 and verse 1 tell you?
22.
What?
21 and 1 is 20.
Oh, thank you, Eddie. Yes. Thank you. What do you got? Travis, redeem us. This is it. So who was born in the time frame of Hezekiah's extended life? Be careful what you wish for. Hezekiah gets these extra years of life, 15 extra years. And when he dies, Manasseh comes to the throne, and Manasseh comes to the throne at 12 years old. In this extra period of life that Hezekiah had, Manasseh is conceived and Manasseh is born. I wonder what kind of teaching and instruction he got. And I hope it was a case of he simply rebelled against the instruction that he got versus he just didn't get any. Here he is coming to the throne at 12. Rod, you're right, he's a teenager. We should probably expect more from our teenagers than what we do, but we're certainly not surprised when they don't do what is right and they need some correction and they need some guidance. But it appears as though Manasseh got none of that, at least in this moment. And so we've looked at all of the different sins of Manasseh for which the nation is going to be condemned. But there's, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story, right? And what's the rest of the story? That's it.
everything, and actually comes back and removes the things that he corrected that were evil.
Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 33. Segundo de Crónicos capítulo 33. Verso 11. 2 Chronicles chapter 33. Look at verse 11. Therefore, the Lord brought the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria against them, and they captured Manasseh with hooks and bound him with bronze chains and took him to Babylon. When he was in distress, he entreated the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. And when he prayed to God, God was moved by his entreaty and heard his supplication and brought him again to Jerusalem to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. What does Manasseh do? He repents. He's forgiven. Look at verse 19, verso 19. These are the rest of the acts of Manasseh, his prayer also, and how God was entreated by him. And all his sin, his unfaithfulness, and the sites on which he built high places and erected the ashram and carved images, before he humbled himself, behold, they are written in the records of the Hosai. So Manasseh slept with his fathers, and they buried him in his own house, and Ammon, his son, became king in his place. It is a story of extremes. You don't find too many characters in the history of the southern kingdom of Judah that are more wicked than Manasseh, more bold and high-handed in their rebellion than Manasseh. But at the same time, you also see a glimpse of the graciousness of God, and we're confronted with the reality that people can what? People can change, and when people do change, what does God do? God forgives. Right? Lest we think that somehow we have become so far separated from God that we're beyond the extent of the touch of his grace, we look at the story of Manasseh, and that idea is just defeated. I think about some of the sins I may have committed. I think of some of the sins maybe some in here are struggling with. I'm willing to bet that none of us have really struggled with the sin of human sacrifice. Right? And I notice there are no altars set up in our auditorium this morning. And that we're not dedicating this auditorium to the worship of false gods or anything like that. We haven't gone that far. But Manasseh did. And Manasseh was forgiven when he humbled himself and repented towards God. And if he can be forgiven, I can be forgiven as well. Brother Roach. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good answer.
Also, though, even though Manasseh repented, it's still the sins of Manasseh that Judah's being because his sins, people still worship in high places and did things even after his repentance.
Sure.
They have enduring effects. He might have been repentant, he might have been forgiven, but his sins still had a bad effect.
We can't unring the bell. And we can be forgiven for ringing the bell, but the bell still tolls, and the effects are still there. Right? We can't go back and undo the consequences of sin. We can be forgiven of sin. And this is one of the great reasons why older generations, I'm thinking of Titus 2, for instance, older generations need to warn younger generations about sin, because when we're young, do we see all of the consequences of the sins that are before us? Absolutely not. This is where voices of wisdom need to come in and counsel and guide and help us see some of those things a little bit clearly. Mike? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't get a feel for how soon some of these sins started within his reign. No, not necessarily.
But I do think the point is it does develop over time.
Yeah.
Very small, when you give an inch,
You don't just wake up one morning, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're taking Baal and right there in the temple. That you don't wake up one morning and do that, obviously, right? Gradual, little by little, certainly. Bill.
I think it does happen kind of greater degrees.
Mm-hmm.
I find it interesting that it took the hooks at Manasseh to be captured by the Babylonians for him to see God.
Sure. Absolutely. Bruce, did I see your hand up? Yes, sir.
I want to go back to the phrase humbling himself.
We're not going backwards, Bruce. No, I'm just playing. Come on. Come on, man.
So humbling himself to God, and God forgave him of his sin.
Yes.
I want to go back to Saul. We studied Saul a few weeks ago.
Great point.
And God told Saul, when you were little in your own eyes,
Absolutely.
you were a good king. But then you elevated yourself and you stopped listening to my commandment, and you thought that you knew better than I did. So when Saul was little in his own eyes and humble, that's when he was a good king.
You know, oftentimes sin brings suffering in this life. Not always, but oftentimes it does. Oftentimes, and we've heard this in sermons and Bible classes before, right? Sin takes us further than we want to go, keeps us longer than we want to stay, and makes us pay more than we want to pay. And when sin extracts that heavy toll from us, we find ourselves in hardship, in suffering. We find ourselves being carried away by symbolic chains and hooks. But what did it take for Manasseh to learn his lesson? And it took the chains, it took the hooks, it took the loss of so much, right? Sometimes when we face down the consequences of our sin, it's as though we want to double down and we think that we can avoid the hardship that sin brings by being prideful, by being puffed up, by not seeking God in that moment, by not humbling ourselves. Maybe it's doubling down on the sin. Maybe it's engaging in more sin. Maybe it's just shutting out voices and pretending like it doesn't matter. When sin brings us low, we do ourselves a disservice by not seeking to learn the lessons that are around us. And we may think, hey, we're getting back far more than what our sin should be giving to us. And I don't know if that's the right way to think, but I do know this. We see example after example in Scripture of people who repented and people who changed and people who came out better. But before they came out better, they had to hit rock bottom. Would you agree that sometimes we need to allow ourselves to hit that rock bottom? And sometimes we may have to allow those that we love to hit that rock bottom, as difficult as it might be before we can move on to better things, before we can find that forgiveness, and before we can make those changes. Jim, go ahead.
In looking at this, I wonder that we hear these kings, okay, they're bad and good, and that God is going to punish Israel for the sins of Manasseh. And I go, wait a minute, Manasseh's sins? Why is everybody else being published? Truth of the matter is, everybody else were party to it, almost all.
Yeah.
Sure, Manasseh came back, repented, and took all of the idols and things out of the temple, but by the time of Ezekiel, they were all back in there, plus.
Yes.
And in Ezekiel 14:20, God, in speaking of the nature of the people of Israel, he said, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, says the Lord Jehovah, they should deliver neither son nor daughter. They should deliver their own souls by their righteousness.
So we know righteous people were delivered and taken in captivity, Daniel and his associates, and Ezekiel and others. As a matter of fact, God says that he actually took them into captivity to save them. And they didn't think so at the time. So it was the nature of the nation and the people in the nation that was sinful, but they were led by their leader. That caused it. And as someone once said, or you said, once it started, it's hard to stop.
Right. Good point. All right. Thought question number 3. You're looking from Isaiah through the rest of the minor prophets. Which prophets are noted to be active during the reign of a king from either northern or southern kingdom? Which prophets?
Amos.
Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos, Micah, Zephaniah. We're seeing all of these mentioned in connection with a specific king, so that helps us put on a timeline kind of where they are and to understand what's going on at that time. We answered number 4 last week. Did the northern kingdom ever actually have a chance to succeed? The answer is yes. They absolutely did, right? But it was going to take Jeroboam doing what?
Obeying the Lord.
Listening to God's voice and heeding what God said, right? And obviously that is not what happened. All right, let's go back to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15. Look at Genesis chapter 15 and verse 7. So this is after the first few promises have been made to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. We have a promise given to Abraham in chapter 15 about a son that is going to be born to him. Keep reading with me, verse 7. Genesis capítulo 15, verso 7. He said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. He said, O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? He said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought all these to him, cut them in two, laid them in half opposite each other. He did not cut the birds in half. Birds of prey were coming down. Abraham was driving them away from this bloody scene. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. Behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But then I will also judge the nation whom they serve, and afterward they will come out with a great many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here. Who will return here? Your descendants will return to this place. Because, and it's not happening until the 4th generation, because the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. Verse 18. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite, the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. So this land, God says what? To Abram. I'm giving it to your descendants. Not immediately, I'm giving it to them after 4 generations, because we've got to wait for the Amorite sinfulness to be, to come to a point where God is going to judge them and disinherit them. The point being there, God just doesn't what? God doesn't just casually up and decide, hey, this nation, you're out. God has reasons for it. And the reason he was going to disinherit the Canaanites was what? Their sin. Their sin had not yet reached that point to be disinherited, but it would reach there eventually, and God says what's going to happen. And so in the 4th generation, I will do what? I will give the land to your descendant. Question. What did Abraham have to do to receive that? Think about this entire scene that's going on here.
He was obedient to God, did what God asked him to do.
He was faithful.
He had to remain faithful. And remain faithful.
Does he have to do anything to receive this promise?
No.
There's nothing here. This is God saying what? This is God saying, I'm going to do this. This is the significance of this bloody animal scene here, and God passing through the midst of them like a smoking torch in a burning oven. This was the way you made covenants back in this day, and God says, may this death happen to me if I don't fulfill my word. Abraham, I am going to give your descendants this land. That's what God had promised, that his descendants would have this land. Now, look at Deuteronomy chapter 28. All right, Josh, here we go. Deuteronomio.
Yes.
All right. Deuteronomio capítulo 28. Mamet, your turn. Mamet looked at me when I said that. She goes, Deuteronomy 28. Look at verse 15. Verso 15. So, God promises the land to Abraham's descendants without conditions. I will give you the land. In the fourth generation, I will bring your descendants back here. So the reception of the land was all about God fulfilling his promise. But did God give a similar promise in the same way regarding the retention of land, the keeping of the land? We'll look at Deuteronomy 28. Verse 15, it shall come about, if you do not obey the Lord your God to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I charge you today, then all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, cursed shall you be in the country. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the offspring of your body and the produce of your ground, the increase of your herd, and the young of your flock. Cursed shall you be when you come in, cursed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will send upon you curses, confusion, and rebuke in all you undertake to do until you are destroyed and until you perish quickly on account of the evil of your deeds because you have forsaken me. The Lord will make the pestilence cling to you until he has consumed you from the land where you are entering to possess it. The reception of the land was unconditional. But what was conditional? Keeping the land. So as you look at question number 5 here, did God violate the Abrahamic land promise or nation promise when he disinherited Israel and when he disinherited Judah? No. God had kept his promise that he promised unconditionally. I will bring you into the land. But now that he has brought them into the land, he says very clearly, you will keep the land and you will prosper in the land only if you do what? You listen to my law and obey it. But if you turn from me, if you turn away from the hearing of my law, you seek to be like all the other nations around you, this land is going to what? It's going to consume you, spit you out. And so when we look at 722 BC and we see the northern kingdom going off into Assyrian captivity, when we look at 586 BC and we see the southern kingdom falling to Babylon, ultimately, why do they fall? Because they disobeyed God. They lose the land because they failed to obey God and failed to do what he said. All right. Question on that one. Bruce, yes, sir. Sorry.
I think there's also a condition to that promise as well. They had to hold up their end of the bargain as well, and they did not do that, so that's why this happened.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, Kent?
2 Kings 21:9, sort of a summary of that. Manasseh seduced them to do evil more than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the sons of Israel.
Absolutely. So here's the role that Manasseh plays in all of this. All right, so last question, question number 6. One of the last kings of Judah was Coniah. And this is where things get really confusing because this guy is known by about 2 or 3 different names. Coniah or Jeconiah or Jehoiakim. These are all the same person. And when you pull together and put together different scriptures, that makes it clear. We're just not going to run through all of that this morning. Okay. So one of the last kings of Judah was Coniah. Look at Jeremiah chapter 22. Jeremiah 22. And look at verse 30. Actually, go back to, this context starts back in 24, where we see this prophecy coming from God about Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim. And that's how we know this is also Coniah, Jeconiah, or Jehoiakim. Now, verse 30, here's what God says about Coniah. He says, "Write this man down childless, a man who will not prosper in his days, for no man of his descendants will prosper, sitting on the throne of David, or ruling again in Judah." Write this man down childless. No man of his descendants will prosper, sitting on the throne of David, or ruling in Judah. But you turn over to Matthew's lineage of Jesus, and you look at Luke's lineage of Jesus, and who's mentioned in there? Take a wild guess. Coniah. Now, how does that happen?
Well, he did have kids, but they didn't prosper because they weren't obedient. I mean,
Okay.
so his lineage was there,
Okay.
but they didn't prosper because of the part where they didn't obey.
All right. This end part here, no man of his descendants will prosper, and they won't prosper in this way. Sitting on the throne of David, ruling in Judah. What's the significance there?
Jesus.
Okay. Walk me through this a little bit, John.
So, none of Jeconiah's descendants would reign on David's throne in Jerusalem.
Correct.
Jesus is one of the descendants of Jeconiah. So if you're looking for Jesus to return to this earth and reign on the throne of David in Jerusalem, that's a violation.
God has said what?
It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. Is Jesus ruling on David's throne?
Yes.
But not in Jerusalem. He is on David's throne, and we need to affirm that. But not David's throne in Jerusalem, in Judah. Look at Acts chapter 2, and this is where we'll wrap up this morning. Acts chapter 2 and verse 30. Hechos capítulo 2, verso 30 a 33. Acts chapter 2 and verse 30. "And so, because he was a prophet," speaking of David, "and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants on his throne," so these Old Testament prophecies about one of David's descendants sitting on his throne, "David looked ahead and spoke of what? When does Jesus ascend to the throne of David? Upon his resurrection, right. He looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. This Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Therefore, having been exalted where? To the right hand of the Father, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured forth this which you both see and hear." What's the promise in this context? That God would raise up and seat one of David's descendants on his throne. And that did happen. It happened when? When Jesus was raised from the dead, and when he was exalted, verse 33, where? To the right hand of God. Jesus is on the throne of David today, but where is the throne of David today?
Heaven.
It's at the right hand of God. It's not in Jerusalem. And that's the point from Jeremiah 22 and verse 30. That's the point from Acts chapter 2. Appreciate your attention this morning. Travis, do you know what you're teaching about next week? Proverbs. Read the entire book of Proverbs before next Sunday. Get ready for Travis's class. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.